So we've got this new normative ethical theory called deontology, which says, look, to determine whether something is right or wrong, you look not at what the consequences of the action are, or even the intended consequences, but instead you have to make sure to respect the rights of other people and to perform your duties, regardless of what the consequences are. So just to get this in perspective, let's see how deontology differs from consequentialism. So if you think back to when we were looking out at kind of the ethical space of how we theorize about ethics, we've got all these different actions along here at the bottom, and we want to know, well, which of those are the morally good actions, which are the morally bad actions? Well, consequentialism is one theory for sorting those actions into different kinds. So consequentialism says, look, some actions are morally wrong, and other actions are morally required. You're morally obligated to do them. And it says furthermore, look, what makes the difference between what actions are morally wrong and which are morally required? Well, the morally wrong actions are actions in which the number of bad consequences outweighs the amount of good consequences. On the other hand, the actions that you're morally required to do, those actions are determined by being those in which the good consequences of your actions outweigh the bad consequences of your actions. Now, what deontology is going to do is to carve up this space in a different way, to make a different distinction amongst different actions and draw that distinction in a different way. So deontology takes all of those different actions that people can perform, and instead of dividing it up between actions that are morally wrong and actions that are morally required, it divides up actions between actions that are morally wrong on the one hand, and then actions that are morally permissible. They're okay. You're not obligated to do them, but it's not wrong if you do them. And then it has a different underlying theory about what makes the difference between these two different sorts of action. So deontology says, look, the things that are morally wrong, the actions that you morally ought not to do, are those actions in which you violate someone's rights or you fail to perform your duties. On the other hand, there's a bunch of actions that you can take that will respect other people's rights and will allow you to perform your duties. So deontology says, look, as long as you're respecting other people's rights and doing your duty, it's morally okay for you to act. But if you act in a certain way and it violates someone's rights or makes it so that you're not performing your duties, well, then you're doing something morally wrong. So you can see a lot of deontology is going to hinge on, well, just which exactly rights and duties do people have? Just like for consequentialism, we had to have, additional theories about, which consequences are good and which are bad. So we got lots of different flavors of consequentialism depending on what sort of consequences we thought are good and which sort of consequences we thought were bad. For deontology, you're going to get lots of different flavors of deontology depending upon what theory you have about what sort of rights and what sort of duties folks have. So the hope is that will be able, however, to make sense of some of these odd sort of trolley cases where you might say, right, maybe in the top left-hand corner, it's morally okay for you to pull the lever and run over that one person because, you're not really violating any rights and you're just kind of a rando here. You don't have any particular duties. So if you pull the lever, you're not really doing anything wrong. But gosh, in the bottom scenario here, if you're a doctor and you have a patient with a sore throat that comes to you and you kill that patient, even though killing that patient and using their organs to save these 5 other patients, even though that might be better consequences overall, you have shirked your duty. You violated your duty as a doctor to help out your patient with the strep throat and your duty not to kill your patients who come to you with strep throat. So deontology can make sense of why we think an action like that is morally wrong. But again, a lot is going to depend upon just what sort of duties you think you have as a doctor and what kind of rights other people have. And a lot of this class going forward will be looking at just what kinds of rights we think people have and what kinds of duties we think people have, and in particular looking at how your duties might change depending on what job you are in or what profession you're a member of. So in order to make sense of that, it helps to have a more solid grounding on deontology. So what I gave you this week was a reading from Immanuel Kant, who's an 18th century philosopher and one of the sort of most influential deontological theorists. So he's giving you one flavor of deontology, because not only is he a deontologist, he thinks that you should respect people's rights and perform your duties, he's got a very particular theory about just which duties and rights people have. So when we come back in the next video, I'll clarify some of what Kant was saying in that reading for this week and give you a sense of what Kant's flavor of deontology is all about.